Okay, so welcome everyone to our fourth session of Obliquity. We're welcoming Sarah and Dr. Rolando Del Maestro tonight. And the topic will be Poetry, Art, and Neurosurgery, a Search for Meaning. And it might be a little bit confusing with the session 4 for people who have been following along. Our session 3 with Georgia Weber has been postponed and might be moved to September. So this is our scheduled session 4, but our third Obliquity session that has happened this year. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sarah to do her introduction.
Yeah, thanks again to everyone who could make it tonight. I'm the Arts and Humanities in Healthcare and Medicine rep for the 2024s, and I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rolando Del Maestro. He's a Canadian neurosurgeon and researcher in Montreal, and fun fact, he's notably the owner of a very impressive private collection of materials relating to Leonardo da Vinci, and he's definitely no stranger to the intersections between arts and medicine. And the title of the talk tonight is Poetry, Art, and Neurosurgery, a Search for Meaning. Yeah, so Dr. Rolando Del Maestro, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks everybody for being on the call. And you'll note here that my wife Pam is also on the call. Now she's my harshest critic by a long shot. So if I'm not saying anything correctly or anything like that, she'll I'm sure sort of straighten me out, as she always has done for my whole life. So from that point of view, I'm very, very pleased that she's on to keep me doing a great job tonight for you all. So I'm going to just start sharing my screen in a second, but how I'm going to start this is that I want you all to sort of think just for a second and imagine you're in Venice. It's sort of nighttime. The wind is blowing a little bit, and you happen to be there with your wife or partner. And you're in St. Mark's Square, and you're looking over the Adriatic, and you get the feeling that there's something in the air. It's a little darker, the air gets a little heavy. The wind is sort of picking up, the gondolas are going up and down and up and down. You can smell something in the wind. And just imagine you're just sort of sitting there and looking over the Adriatic, and you think that there's a storm coming. And the both of you and your partner are watching and watching, and night's falling. It's a bit deserted. And you think about writing a poem. Storm over Venice. The night in Venice, clear and crisp. Whispers of light announce you're coming. Storm, storm. Wind blown, rain filled. Lightning echoes off the old stones. Light will not change them. Rain will not harm them. They don't even notice our footsteps. The rain will wash us away. I remember the night with a certain passion, a true lust for the storm, the time, the light. Looking out, the lightning illustrates a crack in time. We are here. People have been in this very spot for centuries, have seen and experienced the same storm, the same passion. Have listened to the music of the square, have felt the same sun. God, we must go on. The thread of us all flows through each storm, uncommitted. The storm cannot be for us alone. It is to tell us of all the others who have lived their time as it should be lived. We flee when the rain tumbles from the sky. We race along the narrow streets. The footing is wet. We laugh with the rain. The rain is heavy with time, impregnant with drops of eternity. We race to the second floor loft, find a door, wet hair, laughing, and in awe. We've touched the face, and it has smiled on us. When I was about 35, I put this particular poem in, along with the number that you'll hear tonight. What's interesting, if you look at the sort of report I got back from the editor, on the first one, which you can see up here, it says, on restoring Leonardo's picture. I really got, if you go to the end here, I got, it's on file, but it was never published. Storm over Venice didn't even make it. It sort of had some interest, but it was declined. To Pam, which you'll hear later, it was accepted. But what's interesting, if you look at the bottom here, come back here for a second. Comments, your poetry searches for meaning. And therefore, it makes some sense that the title of this particular talk should have a number of different components: poetry, art, and neurosurgery, and a search for meaning. Searching for meaning is sort of a difficult sort of concept. It involves a long sort of struggle from early time periods to later. And then for a person like myself, who has been a neurosurgeon for 35 years and I'm now retired, not really retired, but at least not doing neurosurgery anymore. Looking back has a certain sort of nostalgia, but it also has a certain rethinking of what it was all about. I'm going to sort of just touch on a few areas, one being beginnings and evolution. I'm really going to focus a lot on the importance of mentors, because I think of all the various components I'm going to talk about here, probably the importance of mentors, at least in my life, has been what has directed me more than probably anything else, along with my wife and loved ones. There are certain pitfalls and challenges to doing anything, medicine being one of them. And making decisions on what you're going to do is really critical in multiple different time periods, both getting into medicine, deciding what you're going to do, what residency you're going to go into, and how you're going to live your life after that. I'm going to talk a little bit, and really maybe ask some of the people who are presently in medicine, is really medicine calling, or is it just a job? And for all of us, there's going to be a life after medicine, and a life after neurosurgery for me. So I think with that sort of overall sort of concept and numbers of themes, I'm going to go on a little bit. Beginnings of an evolution. Each of us is formed by a series of continuously changing life experiences, beginning as children and through our adolescence, which really forms a basis for our evolution into adulthood. Parents, family, and friends are the core of this time, define the future development. This is my daughter, Aunt Evie, my granddaughter. Through this talk, I want to sort of make sure that everybody sort of realizes that for me, the core issues associated with life are associated with family, love, and the ability to express love to family and other individuals. And so that really is a core, which I'm going to sort of try to talk about a little bit with you today. Now, one of the questions you have to start with is, where do you actually come from? Where do you come from? How did you get here? And how does that make you who you are? For me, this is my mother and I. I'm about 3 here. It's my passport picture along with my mother, traveling on a large boat coming from Italy to Canada after the Second World War. I must say, very, very difficult time period for Italy and a difficult time period for my family. Arriving in Italy and traveling through some of the areas, I must have been somewhat, I guess, coming from a very small town in the mountains of Italy and reaching Genoa and seeing this massive ship that was to take us somewhere. It's hard. Obviously, I don't remember much, but I have some memory of this huge, monstrous ship that was taking us away from my grandmother. My father had left for Canada about 6 months earlier, and therefore he hadn't been around. But I knew I was going to see him. My mother obviously continued to tell me so. We arrived in Halifax on the 24th of December, 1952. It's rather amazing. My mother didn't speak a word of English. I didn't speak a word of English for sure. But somehow we got on a train and got to Montreal. From Montreal, we took another train, and when we were taking that train, Christmas arrived. And Christmas, for us on the train, was an orange. I sort of remember that aspect. But we arrived in Toronto, and my father was there. And I remember coming out a chute. We came out a chute, for example, my mother and I carrying what we were carrying and what we could carry at that time. And I looked out, my father was quite tall. And I remember seeing him. And we were together again. Family was together again. My father and mother were married in 1947. My father had spent 6 years in the war, the Italian campaigns in various countries, catching malaria on Corfu and having problems with it for much of the rest of his life. You can see here a picture of my mother and my father and myself when we were together in Canada. So in essence, this is how my beginning started, at least in the Canadian part of my life. Now, what was interesting was my mother had gone to grade 5 and she really wanted to be a teacher. But her father felt that the best thing that she could do was to sort of work on the farm, and so she never got to fulfill that particular dream. My dad had gone to grade 3 and had worked on the farm all the time and spent 6 years in the war. And clearly his whole time period in the war was one of literally his later adolescence and early 20s was spent in various types of battles. But it's interesting, every week during that time period, there arrived at her home a magazine called The Grand Hotel. And it was in Italian. In it, there were various stories, various other things, but there was always portions of it on art and poetry and some writing. And every time it arrived, my mother would put me on her knee and we'd go through it together. Now, there has been lots of discussions about these types of sort of magazines. And this particular article talks about the worthless escapism, or are these particular magazines a part of history? All I can tell you is for our family, this particular magazine was quite important. It linked us back to Italy. The only way we could interact with Italy was to write. Now, obviously, that was something that my mother and I would do, but it would only be involved back and forth communication. There was no calling on the phone. There was no internet. There was no other issues. So in one way, it was a sort of more confined sort of life associated with living in a small town in Ontario. Now, my mother, for reasons that I still don't understand, loved opera. I don't even know where she heard opera, but she loved opera. So, well, this is Mario Lanza, but our home was filled with records, those big records that had various types of singing by Mario Alonso, but particularly the operas. And so when I would come in the home, operas would be going, La Traviata, Ada, Tosca, all the various types of operas. And that was just something that would just reverberate around the home all the time. So in one way, I had this marvelous upbringing, love and family. And my father could do anything. He, in the war, had learned all kinds of different skills. But what was sort of more interesting about him is the way he applied those skills. Imagine, for example, we were living in a small town in Ontario, and they were building a very large refinery. At that time, it was called White Rose in Sarnia. Now it's the Shell refinery. And there was massive numbers of men that were needed to build that. So my father told me that every morning, what would occur is all the men would sort of line up. I'm sure just like what happens in the United States with the various types of illegal immigrants. And the foreman would come out and he would decide how many of the men he wanted that day. He would pick them out. What was happening with my dad was that he worked every day. And I asked him, because at that time, I happened to be living with my mom, my dad, and 5 other men who had come over at the same time, all in the same apartment. And what was interesting about that time period was that I had 6 dads. Rather remarkable. I had 6 dads to play with, and they all played with me. My father mentioned that he was working, and the reason he was working was that he would work twice as hard as the others. He couldn't speak English, but he certainly could work hard, and therefore he always worked. It's a very important lesson in a way, that there's always lots of different individuals about. But the questions are, why do some individuals do a little bit better than others? And part of it, I think, was my dad's willingness to work hard, and always do the very best job he could. Interesting lessons to learn. My dad was involved in a rather significant accident. A drunk driver struck the car on his side, and he broke his leg, damaged his larynx and other things. He was in hospital for about 6 months. Obviously, that was a very difficult time for the family. What was interesting, when he got better, he decided that there was a new plant that was opening up in our town called Petroleum. So he took me along. The reason he took me along is I could speak English already. It didn't take me long to learn how to speak English, because that's what all the children spoke around us. So I learned it very quickly. And so I remember we were in this great big long line, all kinds of men. My father was there, and I was there. I was probably about 5 at the time. And the foreman came along, and he reached my father, and he said, "Well, what can you do?" My father didn't understand. He looked over at me, and I said, "Dad, what he said was, what can you do?" My father put out both of his hands. What's interesting is he got the job and worked at that job until he died from the sort of consequences of the carditis that had resulted from his malaria. So in one way, I suppose coming to Canada had multiple advantages for us, for sure. And in another way, it separated us from our family that we tried as best we could to connect with. Money at that particular time period was not very easy to get. And I did not go back to Italy until I was about 15 years old. So my memories of Italy were when I was about 3, and then going back when I was about 15. So one of the things that's interesting is how does your background affect how you go forward, how you make decisions? So maybe what I'll do here, Sarah, is how would you answer that question? How would you answer the question concerning how your background helps you or doesn't help you really going forward?
I guess for me, like my background is that my dad is French Canadian and my mother, she immigrated from South Korea. So kind of have that sort of like half immigrant family kind of experience growing up in Canada and kind of growing up in different cultural environments at the same time. I think has played a huge role in like my, I guess, my interest in learning about new cultures or openness to finding out about other people in Canada. So, and that fueled also my desire to go into medicine. So it, yeah, it, that whole idea of how everything just sort of ties together and propels you forward, it resonates with me.
Now, Sarah, when you're thinking about how did your bringing up have decision related to going into medicine? How did that work?
For me, it had to do with seeing different communities in Canada. So, I guess to be more specific, I would volunteer in reserves in Alberta and kind of seeing the the state of things there. That made me want to go into medicine. And the reason I went into those communities is, and the reason I felt I could connect with those communities is because from a young age I had to kind of navigate different cultural environments, and that kind of ties back into my cultural background. So, so that gave me the desire to go into medicine.
Well, mine was a little different in the sense that when I was in high school, there was a group of us that were clearly outcasts, and we wrote poetry. And one of the sadnesses of my life is I don't have many of those poems. I don't have any of them. And somewhere in my high school time period, I decided that I wanted to be a poet. I, mentioned that to my mother, and she ran around the house screaming. And what she said was, "How are you going to eat?" Obviously, being a poet, making a living at being a poet is not exactly easy. That obviously was her assessment. And based on my productivity as a poet, she was absolutely right. No question about that. But from her concept, she wanted one son to be a doctor, one son to be a dentist, because that was sort of what worked, what she considered to be, what would fill, what would help the family and help other individuals around. So it is interesting how these sort of connections make you move into the areas. And Marisha, what are your thoughts about growing up and how that's made you what you are now?
Yeah, so similar to Sarah, I have a mixed background as well. My mom is Canadian and my dad is East Indian from Nairobi. And so I had the influence of both cultures as well when I was growing up. And then later I was raised by my dad primarily, and having such a strong role model in my life from a really young age. And my dad is actually in the dental field. He's a denturist. And that was kind of when I think back about where my desire to connect the arts and sciences together. I think a lot about my dad because we used to spend a lot of time at his office when we were younger and watch him build the dentures. And building dentures is a whole stepwise process, from making the first wax model and then curing that and setting it into plaster, and then eventually replacing the wax with acrylic. And I thought it was such a beautiful, magical process, seeing how the wax would kind of melt away in the curing process and you'd just be left with the teeth in the proper places. And then he'd replace that again with the acrylic and grind it down until it was the perfect shape for the patient. And yeah, it just really made me think about kind of functionality versus beauty and versus the aesthetic side of things as well. And so I think that was the first time I thought about merging the arts and sciences together. Medicine came much, much later. I think that came after I had some other experiences volunteering with kids and things like that. But I'd say that really started things for me to even head in the direction of medicine and also see medicine as a field that allows you to, again, merge the arts and the sciences together.
Well, thank you. It's interesting how we all have our experiences, and each of these experiences sort of, in one way, define who we are and continue to define who we are throughout the rest of our lives. I'm going to sort of just talk a little bit about mentors, because I think that mentoring is probably one of the more important or most important sort of aspects of your life as you develop decision-making as to what you're going to do. So you can define a mentor as someone who provides guidance or advice or feedback, support. You can serve as a role model for a teacher, a counselor, an advisor, sponsor, advocate, ally, really depending on one's specific goals and objectives at that particular time period. But I sort of brought it really to the idea that what really do you get from mentors? One thing you get from mentors, I think, is sort of an engagement with the glories of life. This is Jaroslav Havelka. Jaroslav Havelka was professor of psychology at Western University when I was an undergraduate. And he was a marvelous individual. So marvelous that when he was giving lectures, you couldn't get in. There was 200 or 300 people that were at the lecture, but the lecture hall held 500, and you couldn't get in. You had to sit on the floor because everybody was so interested in what he had to say. He spoke 9 languages. He was an artist. His art was really involving 2 things. Really, the suffering of man was one, and trees was another, the beauty of the world. So all the time, there would really be issues about those 2 particular issues. He also always came to the classroom carrying sort of a folder. And one bright and brave young man one day in the middle of the lecture, because he never opened it, got up and said, "Professor Havelka, what's in the folder?" So he went over, picked up the folder and opened it, and there was nothing in it. And he said, "Well, I have to carry this around so the other sort of professors in the department think that I have notes." And it gives you some idea of some of the individuals and how we sort of looked at the world. He believed that Mozart was the most creative person that had ever lived. Now, this was interesting because his belief came from the idea that Mozart music really came out directly from his head. There was very few corrections. Beethoven, Bach, others had corrections everywhere. But most of Mozart music has very few corrections, as though they just flowed out of his mind as sort of a combination of sound or orchestral colors. Mozart is buried, as you can see here, in a nice sort of burial ground, but he was actually thrown into a pauper's grave. When you listen to one of Mozart's The Magic Flute, Dr. Havelka believed that he didn't believe in marks at all. There's only two marks that he believed in. One was pass, the other was fail. During my internship, I continued to be quite interested in creativity and psychology. And Dr. Velka had a course at night. And so I was taking that course during my internship. Interesting about that particular course was when you walked into the course, Mozart's music was playing. And when you left the classroom, Mozart's music was playing. To pass the course, you had to take another individual, pick someone else who you felt you could put up against Mozart. And there were two face-to-face discussions with the professor in which you would take your titan, whoever that happened to be, and try to convince the professor that your particular person that you had chosen was better than Mozart. Now, interestingly, if you think about it, there's not that many people you can pick. As an Italian, I wandered around for a period of time thinking about who I would choose. And I ended up in a small bookstore, and there was a Pelican book. It's actually a paperback that I still have by Kenneth Clark, which is probably still the best book that was ever written related to Leonardo. And I'm picking it up and reading through it. I felt, yes, now I had my champion. This is who I was going to sort of put against Mozart. So, two discussions with the professor. One on Leonardo da Vinci and anatomy. Another on Leonardo da Vinci and surprise, how some of his drawings literally surprise you. And also the information from Paul Valery, who said about Leonardo that what a person leaves after them are the dreams that the name inspires and the works that make the name a symbol of admiration. So I came sort of relatively prepared, I felt. Professor was reasonably impressed. He gave me a pass, but it was clear that I could have done better. And he opened up the book, turned it to the introduction. And this is what Kenneth Clark said about Leonardo in the introduction. Yet just as Leonardo, in his intellectual pursuits of natural forces, hung on with a kind of inspired tenacity, so that in the St. John we feel him pressing closer around the form, penetrating further and further into the mystery. To the last, he seems to become a part of it, so that, like his contemporaries, we no longer think of him as a scientist, a seeker for measurable truth, but as a magician, a man who, from his close familiarity with the processes of nature, has learned to discern the secret of creation. I think sometimes when I consider my interest in Leonardo and my interest from that time in Leonardo, professor's ability to sort of instill in me the idea that I could do better. With the person I had chosen, I could do better. And in one way, I think I may be trying to do better to this day, trying to sort of understand a little bit more of what some of this magician and the process of learning these disturbing facts about creation are all about. This is the poem that was a possibility. And how it arose was that my wife and I had gone to Milan and were to see the Last Supper. I had seen the Last Supper a number of times by that time, and it was being cleaned in chains. And so I had seen it in partial glory, in the sense that if you look at on the right, for example, you can see what it looked like when you watched it and could see it sort of from afar. And then when I was there, there is an individual who was using a microscope and literally picking off every little piece that was not Leonardo's. Last Supper had been repainted about 8 times. And so I asked that person, picked off little pieces, and you could watch those pieces dropping down and being picked off and put away. Very large parts of the painting literally disappeared. And so there was a certain sadness because I'd seen it before when it was more colorful, when you put it that way. And I was now seeing it sort of picked apart. Now, coming out of the church, I wrote this poem on restoring Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. The sadness has deepened, touched my soul, hurt me. Pearl upon pearl of the painting is removed. The bones may remain. They have little flesh. Leonardo, what have they done? The attempt you made still has some smoke, some fire. Hopefully, all will not be obscured by microscopic zeal to find a few specks of your soul. The picture will pay dearly, a dream evaporating into dust. You can make your own decisions, but I've sort of changed my decision over time. You can see what it looked like on the left before, what it looked like when I saw it and wrote the poem in the middle, various parts of it were being done in squares, and what it looks like now with the large areas that had no paint filled in with some color. So it's an evolution. It's an evolution from what was there to what is there now. Something that's interesting related to the sort of issues associated with all art, how they start and how they finish. The second mentor I'm going to talk to you about really has to do with direction, helping you with direction. And sometimes I think the world, can be considered to be in what medicine can be considered to be poetry in a way. So to the poetry of medicine, Dr. Drake contributed a number of poems. To the poetry of vascular surgery, however, he contributed whole libraries. He was chief of surgery and also chief of neurosurgery at Western University when I was there as a neurosurgical resident. Well, the interesting story about him, when I was in about third year, I was unclear as to whether or not I wanted to do neurology or neurosurgery. And that's a decision that all of you are going to have to make. And it's a big decision because the decision is, do I take a scalpel and cut into the human body, or do I not do that? There are differences, substantial differences in the way you deal with this particular issue. And I wasn't at all sure that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. So in third year of my medical school, I went to see a secretary. I was very brave, I guess, and asked if I could speak with Dr. Drake. Dr. Drake at the time was chief of neurosurgery, chief of surgery, and probably the most well-known neurosurgeon in the world. It just happened to be a Western. Patients were coming in from all over the world, being flown in almost every day to be cared for. And she made an arrangement for me to see him. I came back a few days later, walked into his office, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, why are you here?" And I said, "Well, Dr. Drake, I'm sort of thinking about neurosurgery and I'm thinking about neurology. I'm not exactly sure which one I want to do." And he gave me all the reasons why not to be a neurosurgeon, including the fact that, everybody will be around the table, Christmas or Easter, some other day. Somebody will come in from an accident. You'll get up from the table. You'll operate all night. And when you go back, everybody will be going home. That time, about 50% of the neurosurgeons ended up getting divorced. He also mentioned there were no physicians, neurosurgeons, because so many had been added. And he went on with a number of other particular reasons why not to be a neurosurgeon. But then he said something that I think if you can remember this, it will help you. He said, people always make room for excellence. Think about that now. People always make room for excellence. So if you're excellent at what you do, people will always find a position for you. Becoming excellent is difficult, clearly, but that's how it's done. There's lots to learn from Dr. Drake. He always wrote up all his notes, every particular aneurysm he clipped. He had notes on it. He developed instruments. This is what's called the Drake clip. And he would follow his patients over long periods of time, see how they did. And this particular patient, for example, had come from Hawaii to be treated by him. When he was in Hawaii, he went to see him, and he notes that. And, you know, in the chart, there are multiple sort of Christmas cards on this patient.
Dr. Del Maestro, I think there were some issues previously with some people hearing the clip, so we might have to change the audio settings for this clip.
Can you, is that okay?
Oh, we can't hear anything.
Okay, and what you have to do, let me see here. I think, can you? Maybe I have to stop sharing. Let's go to screen share. I'm going to put the sound on here. Can you see that?
Yes.
I tell them that work is the spice of life, and that it does mean some hardship for their family, but there's no alternative to it if you're going to make your mark in surgery. I tell them, at least to me, and I think to many other senior surgeons that I know, that another spice of life is to match your wits with the best in the game. Those minds that are trying to do the same thing you are, to beat the disease and disorder that you face, to lick it. That's what it's all about.
This is a picture of myself operating with Dr. Drake, but there are many other surgeons. This is Dr. Barr, for example, who also taught me a lot about how to operate, but more how to take care of patients, how to care for the physicians who were taking care of those patients, calling them when there were problems, helping them deal with some of the issues that were brought up. So a whole group of individuals were involved in helping me through that particular time of my life. This is another interesting individual, Carl Arfors. When I did my PhD in Sweden, Carl Arfors was my supervisor. Carl was an amazing individual. His father was a Protestant minister in Sweden, but he left home when he was about 14, 15. He worked in the lumber sort of areas, drove big truck, and then decided to go back to school and became a professor of physiology, medicine in the University of Uppsala, and also worked at a number of pharmaceutical areas. He loved art, and he loved cooking. And he loved sort of working with science. From him, I sort of learned 2 of 3 things. Something about science, related to getting my PhD and something about art. Cooking, I never managed to sort of pick that part up related to his mentorship with me from that aspect. So mentors are critical parts of the whole process of developing who you are and helping you through various aspects of that. And I've just outlined three of the ones that I felt were most influential in my life. And I hope that you have such influential sort of individuals in your life also. So if we talk about the importance of mentors, Pamela, your thoughts about finding mentors?
Can you hear me? I think so.
Yes. Yes.
I watch for people at different events, gatherings, meetings, etc., who seem to have something a bit extra or something that really resonates with me that's been similar to what I've been wondering about. And often I'll follow up and start a conversation that often will lead to an ongoing opportunity for working together or for me to continue to connect with them over time. And it's often a very rewarding experience for both of us, I think.
Yeah, I think that the issue of finding mentors and sort of being struck by mentors seem to be able to attract people to them. They seem to be able to have some, let's say, understanding of how people interact with other people. Most of them have a certain kindness that they express in multiple different ways. And I think if you find such individuals, I think it's useful for you to at least see if you can make some types of relationship with them. Sometimes I think too that mentors help you from the point of view of making decisions as to what you want to do. Because sometimes these decisions are not so easy from that aspect, for sure. Elena, how would you find mentors? How have you found the issue about finding mentors?
For me, most of my mentors that stick out to me when I think back to my life have been most of my teachers, my professors. So I guess I've been lucky that way because it's a natural relationship with mentorship anyway. So, I found like one of my most significant mentors was a high school teacher, and then afterwards my graduate supervisor. So they were already in positions where they were obliged to mentor me, but just asking them for support or asking, sometimes even sharing parts of my life with them made it a more, I think, fulfilling mentorship than just being a teacher.
Thank you very much. I think everybody has mentors. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that people can, go through life without having any mentors. I'm sure there are such people, but I think all of us sort of have the ability to sort of link with mentors, and sometimes these mentors, become your friends and your friends for your whole life, and that can be a very enriching type of experience. There's a certain music to the brain, and the brain really allows you to play music like that. But I think what is really important is, what is the music of medicine? Which part of medicine really excites you? I mean, that's the real question here. And I think that's the thing that I think is the most interesting. How you go from thinking about medicine to moving towards one part of medicine that you want to spend the rest of your life in. And in one way, there's sort of, there has to be some music to it. There has to be something that excites your brain and excites your sort of senses to bring you towards that particular area of medicine. If it does not do so, And I think you're missing something of the beauty and the music of each particular specialty that happens to be in medicine. One of the problems, however, in medicine is that there's pitfalls and challenges. Alcohol and drugs and other things are things that, you know, we have to deal with. I'll tell you a story. I just wrote my exams in neurosurgery. I was out about a month. I walked into the surgeon's lounge and one of the anesthetists was drinking from a bottle. I was the only person there, just the two of us. And he looked at me and he said, "You won't tell anybody, will you?" I didn't say anything to him. And I thought about what should I do? And I went to the chief of neurosurgery and I said, "This is what I have seen." And he said to me, "He's a senior anesthetist and you're just a month into practice. It's your word against his." What will happen is that other anesthetists, when they hear about this, will make your life a little bit more difficult. But what may be the major thing is it might make your patients' lives a little more difficult. They may not be so interested in doing your case at night or some other thing. And he sort of cautioned me to not say anything about it. I had a little difficulty with that decision, but I decided not to say anything. About a month later, there was an arrest in the operating rooms. There was a woman who was undergoing a simple operation, and she arrested. And the anesthetist that I had seen drinking was not in the room and was drinking somewhere else. That patient died. To this day, I'm sort of concerned about that decision. Obviously, I made that decision based on advice from a senior surgeon. But I think, looking back, maybe what I should have done in situations like this is I should have talked with the chief of anesthesia and told the chief of anesthesia what I saw. But I couldn't prove it. But this is what I saw. And maybe something would have been done. Maybe his locker would have been opened up and the bottles found. Maybe he would have been talked to. Who knows? Maybe that patient would not have died. So there are pitfalls. And sometimes there's no good answer. And sometimes the advice you get is the best advice that you can get. But sometimes it may not be overall the best solution to a particular problem. So all of us, I think, in medicine have these types of issues that we have to deal with. You know, colleagues who have particular problems, either emotional or mental or associated with drug abuse or alcohol abuse. And the questions are, how do we interact with those individuals? How do we get them help? And I think that's something that we as a group have to deal with on a regular basis. And although you think it won't happen to you or happen to your sort of colleagues that you've gone to school with, but it may. And therefore, I think one has to be aware of these pitfalls and try to sort of deal with them as best one can as one goes through the early part of your career and your particular specialty. The issue of drug abuse in medical individuals is relatively significant. And I've had numbers of my friends who have had severe problems with this particular issue. And I think, again, we have to sort of take a certain kindness to the situation that drug abuse and alcohol abuse and these types of sort of problems that people may have are not really overall problems that we've been able to deal with in our society. We still consider these issues not disease, but problems of failure of ability or failure of intellect or failure of all kinds of other things. I think if we changed our minds and advocated a little bit more for the idea that if we could stop putting people in jail for these types of problems, as for example has been done in Portugal and some other countries, we may be able to move a little further on. Clearly dealing with a marijuana issue is one issue. And what surprises me is that it's not been a particular problem. I think, however, we have to do something as physicians in a more, let's say, advocate type of way to help this situation. There's many different types of problems that we have, but this particular problem is one I think that does have, some type of solution if we can sort of all work together on trying to get to that particular area of solution. I think that's something that, again, is young physicians and medical students, residents, and you're going to have to deal with, and have to deal with in the emergency department, have to deal with in your practice, have to deal with it in all types of different ways. And I think we have to do better. We have to do better. One way you can get through some of these particular issues, the problems and the hard decisions that have to be made sometimes, is with love and happiness. This myself and my wife, Pam, we obviously were quite young at that time. My hair was quite long, as you see here, and it certainly wasn't white. But I think that particular relationship has been one that has sort of allowed me to deal with some of the more difficult problems that I've had to face as a neurosurgeon. One of the issues being a neurosurgeon and putting up an MR scan on a child that's 5 years old and has a brainstem glioma is that we have no treatment. That these patients live about 8 to 12 months. You don't tell the patients that. You don't tell the family that, of course. You don't tell anybody that. You just hold it, and you know it, and we do everything we can. But it does have a long time stress that continues every time you actually put up that CT scan or put up that MR scan that shows one particular problem or another associated with medicine. I was in England away from my wife, and I saw this particular card, and I sat down and I wrote this poem. To Pam, time has parted our hearts, divided us like a stone in a stream. The stone is but small, flooding rivulets will join again. The vertex intermixed, streams always flow to the sea. This is the only poem I've ever had published, which is rather interesting. I tell people many times that the most important decision I ever made was to marry my wife, and I would change every other decision except that. I hope that you have such luck with your decision-making related to your partner. Art has been something that has helped me, not so much from the production of art, but sort of really the collection of art and ability to sort of look through the sort of knowledge of time, particularly related to art. And as I said in my library right now, and I look around and I see the books and paintings and drawings and etchings, etc., and sculpture, there's a certain quietness that's associated with it, something that has helped me through the difficult time periods that I've had being a neurosurgeon, and helped me deal with some of the stresses that I've had to deal with related to patients patients dying and patients' problems in that aspect of it. So the only thing I can say to you is that you have to have something else in your life besides medicine. Medicine is a very severe issue in the sense that if you allow it, it will take all your time. You cannot fill all the needs that your patients have, that your colleagues have, that the system has, that you have to provide. So you need something else to help you. It can be poetry, it can be art, it can be sports, it can be anything you like, but you'll have to put something else in your life besides medicine. You just have to, because medicine at some point finishes. And when it finishes, I've certainly had many of my colleagues who don't know what to do. You know, in an operating room, the surgeon has a fair amount of responsibility. But one day you walk out of that operating room and that is no longer present in any way, shape, or form. And that happens in all surgical and medical specialties. At one point, you walk away. And therefore, you have to have other things that fill your life. So if you can start those things a little bit earlier, whatever they happen to be, whether it's reading, whether it's anything that excites you, that helps you enjoy the interactions of your mind with other parts of the world. I think in that particular situation, I think they'll help you a lot. There's no question at all, in my mind, that having other things in your life will help you. I've always wondered, you know, if you're sitting at a bar and there's a number of people around and you're, all you can talk about is neurosurgery or all you can talk about is medicine, you're a very, very boring person. And therefore you have to have other things to fill your life. One of the things that's filled my life, of course, is my wife. And she's on the call right now. So together we've done much of our work together. Pam and I worked together in the sense that she was a nurse working in my clinics. She was involved in helping patients in multiple different ways that were associated with our clinic and associated with our combined lives and interests. So it's been an honor and a pleasure to have it with me all this time. Well, the question is, what about medicine? Is it a calling or is it a job? I think everybody has seen this particular picture. It's a doctor that stayed up all night with a sick child. And you can see here that it's unclear as to whether or not this child is going to survive or not, or whether the child is almost dead. But it's interesting here that what is the artist has sort of done a number of things. You can see there's some type of medicine here that the doctor is trying to get into the child. Doctor's arm is sort of in this direction. Child's arm is in this direction too. The pillow is in this direction. The father's in the background. It's obviously a poor home. And is that what a doctor really is? Is that what we should be? And I think that's something that all of us have to sort of think about. You know, is our role to care that much? Have we got the ability and the time and the effort to care that much? I think medicine is changing, and it's changing very, very quickly to a very automated type of world. MR scans, CT scans. People don't examine patients very much anymore. We work on other aspects. The sadness when you don't touch people, in particular in the COVID time period, no one touches anybody, there's a certain something very, very lost about the whole issue about medicine. So when you're making a decision on what residency you'd like to go into, clearly you have to make some decisions as to how you want to interact with people. Some radiologists never see anybody. They look at x-rays all day long. Then there are individuals who work in palliative care. Then there are all kinds in between, laboratory specialists, etc. So you have a wide range of things that you can do in medicine. Suppose the issue is during your decision making, try to sort of find an area that maybe you can do both. You can be excellent in whatever you happen to be doing, but also have some caring compassion for the patients that may not do quite as well as you'd like them to do. Maybe we can ask here, can I ask Ashika, what do you think of this picture? Ashika Patel.
Hi, thank you. You got it right the first time,
Okay.
Ashika. So I remember being shown this picture when I'm starting my second year this fall. So when I started first year of med school, I remember being shown this picture, and I believe it was in the context of what does it mean to be a great physician? And one of the thoughts that I had, being fresh-faced into medicine, so excited for the future, I thought, well, a physician is someone who dedicates their all to their patient. And from this photo, this painting, we can see that the doctor is so immersed in the child's health late at night. And that's sort of the ideals that I grew up with when I thought about a physician, someone who puts their patients first. And I know now that I've sort of seen a bit more of the shades of gray involved with medicine, that sometimes it is okay to take time for yourself. It is, in the long run, better for your patients if you do have a well-balanced lifestyle. And sometimes you can't always be there because to err is human, as we've all learned. But that painting sort of depicts my idealistic version of what a physician should be.
Any other thoughts about this picture? Now, come on now, there's got to be some other thoughts. Yes. Yes, Sam.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. I was thinking about this picture as a kind of experience of a physician who is looking at his patient, not only to find any other differential diagnosis of the patient who is in front of him. He is looking for finding the effect of medication or effect of treatment that he done for him. Also, he is here still as a kind of, sympathy with patients, and it's a kind of emotional respect to his patient. So there are three different categories: emotional reaction to the patient, treatment, that he's following the treatment and the effect of treatment, and then third one is he's still thinking about the differential diagnosis. Is there any other possibility that this child is not getting better this time? And I think there are some other things there are some thoughts that I can say about this picture.
Yeah, I think that it's a contemplative type of picture, a thinking type of position, as you've mentioned, and there's a certain sadness in it too. We don't know whether the child survives or doesn't survive, but just looking at the situation, you can make your own decision as to whether the child lives or dies. But I think the important part is that, there's someone who cares and someone who's doing his best to sort of deal with the particular issue that's in front of them this particular time period. It's an interesting picture. It's interesting that it's as dark as it is with the light, and the light shines on the child. Artists have an incredible ability to pick nuances related to interaction between people. And when you look at the picture, it's one thing. But then when you see that, for example, if you look at the shade here, the light shines onto his face and also onto the child. So the artist has done that on purpose. And the artist has put the father in the background. Interestingly, there's no mother there, which would be very unusual, I would think, in a normal type of situation. But maybe there's reasons for this particular painting. The thing about painting and pictures is that they can be interpreted in multiple ways. And the artist is trying to say something, and we do our best to interpret what the artist is trying to say years later, when the artist is no longer around to help us in any way, shape, or form. But it does provide us with sort of intellectual energy to sort of deal with some of the issues and problems that we deal with today. As a neurosurgeon, I spent my life operating on the brain and stimulating the brain in various ways. And we know a lot about the brain. One of the things that amazes me, though, is that where does love come from? I have to tell you, I've never stimulated a part of the brain that suddenly love has appeared. I've never stimulated a part of the brain that suddenly kindness has shown up. The brain has no pain fibers. The great interpreter of pain in the universe has no pain fibers. How did that evolve? So, on times, the present time, we have very sophisticated ways of operating on patients. We can operate on them awake. We can put computers in front of them. We can have continually monitor all kinds of functions. We can monitor their parietal function, their speech function. We can give them complex sort of three-dimensional drawings that they have to deal with. We look at parietal lobe function, mechanical, left and right, mechanical sort of and mathematical functions. And we can hopefully remove tumors without damaging those areas too much. I was always amazed when one part of the brain, sort of in the posterior frontal area, determines whether you can understand red light, yellow light, and green light. I've removed that particular area. The person doesn't know how to deal with those three lights. Sort of interesting complexity that's associated with the human brain. But there's another thing that's interesting. There's a lot of humility that has to be dealt with related to medicine. And patients have a great deal of trust in the physicians. One of the last cases that I operated on was a woman, and she was being operated on awake. And occasionally during the operations, patients get a little sort of stressed. They start moving around. They start sort of beginning to sort of wiggle their heads, although they're in a clamp. And it becomes more and more difficult to control them. The anesthetist starts to get worried. Nurses around start to get worried. And in a small number of those patients, you just can't go on and you have to stop the operation. You put the patient to sleep and you just stop the operation. I knew, however, that this particular patient was religious. And I said to her, you're quite religious. And she said, yes, yes, I do believe in God. And I said, well, why don't you pray for me? So she started to pray. Our Father who art in heaven. It could have been any prayer. What was amazing is very soon, everybody in the whole operating room, the anesthetists, the anesthetic residents, myself, the residents, the nurses, I'm sure they're in their minds, they're praying too. They're saying the same types of words. And in a couple minutes, she completely settles down. She doesn't have any problems whatsoever. Just all that stress, all that concern, all that fear was all gone. It wasn't taken away by medication. It wasn't taken away by anything I said. It was taken away by something she believed in. And therefore, I think part of the ability of being a good physician is to understand that there's many more things associated with health than medication, surgery, etc. There's a lot of different aspects that we've yet to touch on at all. It's not so much that it's an issue of God or religion. It's more an issue of some type of faith and trust. And I think we can learn a lot from these types of situations. I think the other thing we have to be is advocates. When I came back from doing my PhD and began my practice predominantly associated with brain tumors patients, it was clear that there was no brain tumor organization in Canada at that time. We're talking about 1981, 82. And myself and my wife and Steve Northey, that you see here in the far left, and his wife, were associated with starting an organization, Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada, and you'll see how Steve talks about it in a couple of seconds here. But what's interesting here is that when I was doing that, I received a letter from my chairman and asked me to stop because there had been pressure put on from other cancer organizations that if we split off a brain tumor foundation, there'd be less overall funds for them. And so I looked into how many grants were being given by this particular organization for brain tumor patients, and there were none. Therefore, it seemed quite reasonable that we proceed.
When Kelly was diagnosed with a brain tumor at 8 years of age, it was very devastating to us as a family, of course. But I think more devastating than anything else was the fact that there was no information available to us, and that it didn't seem that there was any support groups in place to count on, to fall back on, any people to talk to. So it became very evident that there was a definite lack there that we had to address.
So the three of us started the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada. It's a large organization now. It's been around for about 34 years. It raises millions of dollars a year for research associated with brain tumors and helps families in multiple different ways. So one of the things that I think that is important is that you leave something behind. And I'm sure, as far as Pam and I are concerned, and Steve also, the three people that were associated with starting the organization, that this will be something that will be left behind long after we're gone. And maybe something that will be something of the legacy of my interests and Pam's interests in brain tumors and Steve's daughter who died. Pam, my wife, was associated with writing the first brain tumor handbook, and there's been multiple editions of it from that time. life after medicine, particularly in my situation, life after neurosurgery. Well, a little while ago, the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada celebrated its 35th year, and we've been involved in it all these years. I've been interested in Ulster Library, the history of medicine for many years, and presently I'm on the standing committee. I'm the chair of the standing committee of the Ulster Library of the history of medicine, and continue to have interests related to Sir William Ulster collection and Gill. There's also the issue of giving back. Pam and I endowed a William Ulster Medical Student Essay Award, which was offered by the Ulster Library History of Medicine in 2015. And this award helps medical students from McGill explore the historical, social, ethical, and humanistic side of medicine. Really, investigations to try to unravel the past will hopefully lead to future understanding of the role that medicine has and will continue to play in the enhancement of the human condition. We also provided a family undergraduate student research competition award for the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada. So this is what we've done to try to give back. I've also continued to be involved, although I no longer am involved in neurosurgery. I do direct the Neurosurgical Simulation Artificial Intelligence Learning Center. And our vision is the globalization of safe surgery through the utilization of simulation and artificial intelligence. So I'm very busy with that at the present time. I have multiple graduate students and continue to sort of try to move the field forward. The interesting thing about artificial intelligence is that I'm not sure that the medical students who happen to be on this call understand what this is going to do to medicine in the next number of years. It's a revolutionary type of data processing system. And it can provide information very, very quickly, where it took years to do the research before it can do some of that research in new and novel ways very, very quickly. So artificial intelligence involves machine learning, artificial neural networks, and what's called deep learning. But there's a problem with artificial intelligence. And one of the problems is that, I'm not going to go into it, but there are two concepts related to the idea of consciousness. One idea is what basically is called the workplace theory, the blackboard theory. And it basically suggests that our brain has multiple sort of artificial intelligence types of networks that are running on a continuous basis. And the reason we're conscious is because these particular systems are able to broadcast information to multiple different areas of our brain. And when enough information is being broadcast to enough parts of our brain, we suddenly become conscious. And you can argue, for example, that that may happen when you're dreaming. As you're dreaming, and as more and more parts of your brain are activated related to your dreaming process, that suddenly you become awake. If that's true, what that basically means is the machines are going to become conscious. If it's just the number of artificial intelligence systems that are running, then machines eventually will become conscious. And then the question becomes, if they do become conscious, what would they think of us humans? It's not dystopian, but it's interesting, because the issue of consciousness is an important issue that one has to sort of deal with when one starts dealing with artificial intelligence, the ability of machines to think by themselves without being programmed. Think about that. Machines doing what they want to do without being programmed. You can do all kinds of interesting work based on artificial intelligence. This is our particular hive of artificial intelligence hive, with lots of different individuals involved in looking at these particular problems in the in the Neurosurgical Simulation Artificial Intelligence Learning Center that I run. And you can ask me, well, why are you running an artificial intelligence learning center? Well, there's a number of reasons for it. I was blessed to be able to operate in multiple countries, Saudi Arabia, China, et cetera, et cetera. And I would go there and I would operate there for a week or two, come back, maybe go back the next year. And in truth, very little changes. So basically the concept was, is it possible that can we model on the airplane industry where every single pilot that is trained to pilot a particular airline, jet, or whatever, goes into a very extensive simulation type of programming and learns things based on the simulation before they ever pilot a plane? Can we use that model to improve surgical care, maybe medical care that involves technical activities throughout the world? So that's an interesting sort of issue to sort of think about. Every day as I walk to the Montreal Neurological Institute and Hospital, these words are inscribed on the wall. The problem of neurology is to understand man himself. Walter Penfield. Associated with the human genome, Venter, who was the individual who used machines, which clearly took over the whole process of the human genome, identifying it. He said in the first paper that came out in Science, what's interesting about this particular situation is that Venter and the multiple other groups that were associated with developing the human genome, what had happened was many groups were associated with the sort of industrialized robotic systems. In each of these universities or groups had taken one of the chromosomes and dealt with that particular chromosome. And both groups were ready to put together their information at one time, 2001. And there's an attempt to put Venter's information and the other group's information in one journal. And it couldn't be organized. So in the same week, Venter's information came out in Science and the other information came out in Nature. It's interesting that even at this level, it couldn't be gotten together. Humans couldn't get it together to publish in the same journal. Venter in his journal mentions, his article, the real challenge of human biology, beyond the task of finding out how genes orchestrate the construction and maintenance of the miraculous mechanism of our bodies, will lie ahead as we seek to explain how our minds have come to organize thought sufficiently well to investigate our own existence. Leonardo said that it was a mediocre pupil who does not excel as master. Now, as far as I can see, there were none of Leonardo's pupils that ever excelled him. Clearly, he was an outlier. But maybe a better way of thinking about this is, it is a mediocre teacher whose pupils do not excel him or her. So maybe conceptually, the idea would be, many of you will end up being teachers in many different types of areas. And maybe if you think that your goal is to teach in such a way that your pupils will clearly be better than you, that would be a marvelous legacy to leave behind. All of you have seen this particular picture, I'm sure. Leonardo had access to a woman who died while she was about 10 months pregnant. And rather interesting, in this particular drawing, Leonardo sort of puts some red color and other aspects in the drawing to really make it stand out. He comments, though human ingenuity by various inventions with different instruments yields the same end, It will never devise an invention more beautiful than does nature, because in her inventions, nothing is lacking and nothing is superfluous. As I mentioned, this is my daughter and my granddaughter. What a man leaves after him are the dreams that his name inspires and the works that make his name a symbol of admiration. It would appear, therefore, to leave something behind, you have to leave dreams, which also has to leave works. Thank you very much.